Your old car, radiator, or washing machine may be entering a supply chain Europe tried to shut down but still can't control. What looks like the cleanest part of the economy, recycling, has become a gray corridor for metal, money, and leverage in wartime. Oh, scrap metal is not just trash. It is industrial feedstock. It is melted into rebar, sheet, wire rod, and components that keep factories alive. And when sanctions hit Russia's primary metal exports, recycled metal flows became something else. Harder to police, morally disguised by the language of circular economy. This is not a side story to sanctions. It exposes how Europe's green logistics system can be repurposed into a wartime loophole. The chain starts in places that feel ordinary. Municipal collection yards, auto dismantlers in Germany, appliance recyclers in Italy, demolition sites in Poland. A scrapped boiler here, copper cable there, aluminum wheels somewhere else. Traders aggregate it, grade it, compress it, and move it toward ports like Rotterdam, Antwerp, and sometimes Turkish terminals across the Black Sea Gateway. Ordinary metal becomes a cross-border commodity. On paper, scrap is messy. It is mixed, variable, and often sold through intermediaries. That matters. Sanctions are easier to enforce on a named slab producer, a branded steel mill, or a direct shipment from a blacklisted entity. They are much harder to enforce on shredded ferrous scrap, non-ferrous bundles, or cargo that changes hands 3 times before loading. Ask yourself, when a container or bulk shipment is labeled recycled feedstock rather than finished metal, how many people in the chain are really checking where it will end up? This is where the mechanism gets uncomfortable. After 2022, Europe restricted or phased out broad categories of trade with Russia, especially where revenues could support the war economy. But trade systems do not vanish. They reroute. Reuters, the Financial Times, and trade data firms repeatedly documented how sanctioned or restricted goods often continued moving through third countries, especially where transformation, relabeling, or partial processing blurred origin and destination. Scrap is uniquely suited to that blur because it is already defined by disorder. In 2023, the European Union exported millions of tons of ferrous scrap outside the bloc, with Turkey remaining one of the biggest destinations, according to Eurostat trade data. Turkey is also one of the world's largest scrap importers because its electric arc furnace steel sector depends heavily on imported scrap. That part is legal. The issue is what happens next in a market where steel products, semi-finished inputs, and regional trade networks can mix legally sourced, rerouted, and transformed material in ways customs systems struggle to trace. And once metal is melted, origin becomes less a fact than a paperwork argument. That is the hidden choke point. Not the scrapyard, not even the port, the furnace. Once scrap enters a mill and becomes new steel, the political identity of that material can effectively dissolve. I think this is the part most people miss. Sanctions assume products stay legible. Industrial metallurgy destroys legibility. Sarcastic. Europe tells a comforting story about recycling. You recycle, emissions go down, raw mining pressure falls. Circularity wins. And often, that story is true. But in a sanctions era, circularity also creates opacity. The greener the narrative sounds, the less suspicious the cargo can appear. That's That should bother anyone who thinks policy works just because the headline sounds clean. A second layer is price. Ferrous scrap prices are not abstract benchmark trivia. They shape input costs for construction steel, manufacturing, and regional arbitrage. During the sanctions period, volatility in scrap benchmarks and freight costs changed who could buy, who could melt, and who could undercut rivals. The World Steel Association has long shown that electric arc furnace production relies heavily on scrap availability. When Europe exports large volumes, nearby buyers compete harder. When rerouted demand appears, prices can detach from local logic. Why does that matter to you? Because metal cost moves into buildings, appliances, vehicles, and infrastructure bids. Look at the geography. Scrap collected in Central Europe can move by truck, rail, barge, and bulk vessel. Traders specialize in aggregation. Ports specialize in throughput. Mills specialize in transformation. Each actor can claim a narrow role. The collector says, we only process waste. The trader says, we only sell to approved counterparties. The port says, we move lawful cargo. The mill says, we buy feedstock on market terms. Put together, those narrow roles can form a chain no single participant fully owns. That fragmentation is not accidental. It is the business model. According to OECD work on global value chains, complexity reduces visibility and spreads responsibility so thin that enforcement often lags behind commercial reality. In plain English, everyone touches the metal, but nobody feels accountable for the final geopolitical outcome. I've always found that to be one of the strangest features of modern trade. The more efficient the chain becomes, the easier it is for moral responsibility to evaporate. But this goes beyond theory. In 2024, enforcement debates intensified around indirect flows into Russia, neighboring states, and intermediary markets, especially for dual-use goods, industrial inputs, and materials with military relevance, according to EU policy updates and reporting from Reuters and the Wall Street Journal. Scrap itself is not a missile, but steelmaking capacity, foundry supply, and industrial continuity matter in war. Armored vehicles, rail repair, shell casings, machine parts, and logistics hardware all depend on metal ecosystems, not just one dramatic shipment. That is the deeper insight here. Wars are not sustained only by headline weapons. They are sustained by boring inputs. Bearings, wire, plate, castings, rail steel, structural sections. If sanctions focus on glamorous categories and ignore feedstock liquidity, they can miss the bloodstream while watching the hand. Mini-hook. And the most revealing part is not in Moscow. It is in Europe's own incentive structure. Collectors want high prices. Traders want spread. Ports want volume. Mills want flexible input. Governments want green recycling targets. None of those incentives were designed for wartime leakage. Yet together, they can reward exactly that. When scrap prices rise, more material is pulled into the export stream. When domestic processors cannot match bids, material leaves. When it leaves into a region where trade onward is difficult to map, capacity becomes profitable. There is also a legal gray zone between what is prohibited, what is transformed, and what is merely inconvenient to trace. Customs law cares about classification. Sanctions law cares about counterparties, ownership, and prohibited end uses. Commodity trading lives in the space between those systems. If you wanted to design a loophole without calling it a loophole, you would build something that looks very close to the scrap trade. But wait, the twist is bigger than rerouting. Europe may be helping fund the very pricing conditions that make this system durable. When scrap becomes scarce or strategically valuable, buyers with urgent industrial demand pay up. That pushes benchmark prices higher. Higher prices pull more European scrap into export channels. And those higher flows can stabilize supply for mills outside the strictest sanction perimeter, which can then sell finished or semi-finished products back into global markets in forms that are far harder to morally decode. The loop feeds itself. So, the recycled washing machine in Belgium does not become a tank by magic. That would be a lazy claim. What it can become is part of a price system and material pool that preserves industrial flexibility in a war economy. That is subtler, and in my opinion, more important. Because policymakers love direct causation. Real trade power often works through indirect capacity. Consider one more uncomfortable point. The European Commission has repeatedly debated tighter controls on scrap exports, partly over environmental concerns and partly over strategic raw materials. Not just because of Russia, because scrap is no longer mere waste. It is a strategic resource in decarbonized steelmaking.